Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Why Housing Messages Backfire and What We Can Do. My name is Amy Clark, and I am Senior Director of Marketing and Communications at the National Housing Conference. Joining me on this webinar are Tiffany Manuel, Vice President for Knowledge, Impact, and Strategy at Enterprise Community Partners, and Nathaniel Kendall Taylor, CEO at the Frameworks Institute. I'd like to thank Capital One for sponsoring NHC's webinar series. Any opinions or errors, however, are ours alone. The National Housing Conference is committed to connecting the housing community with the resources you need to move housing forward, particularly when it comes to effective communication. On today's webinar, we'll discuss housing messaging pitfalls and simple things housers can do to advocate more effectively and build support for affordable housing. Tiffany and Nat will discuss the ways typical affordable housing messages backfire and what we can do differently to improve our affordable housing campaigns and counter community opposition to affordable developments in our neighborhoods. So now I'm going to turn it over to Tiffany to get us started with our conversation.
Great. Let's see. All right, can you see that?
Yes, you are live.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Amy, and not just saying thank you to you, but also to the whole staff at the National Housing Conference. You all have been fantastic, and I just want to send a little bit of a shout out at the beginning of our conversation here. You all have done such a good job kind of keeping the field, being really thoughtful about how we're communicating about the work in the housing and kind of opportunity and community development space. That Nat and I are really excited and happy to join you and providing this contribution that we think is really important to the field kind of through this platform. So with that, I just want to say welcome to everybody on the call. I am from the Enterprise Community Partners. Enterprise is a national housing and community development intermediary. Many of you on the call have worked with Enterprise, and so I'm happy to be representing kind of the work that we do at Enterprise on this call today. What I'll just say is just a little background about how we got here. I used to work at the Frameworks Institute with my good friend Nat Kendall Taylor, and when I got to Enterprise just a little over 5 years ago, I was really surprised that there really wasn't the kind of research around how our messaging is sort of working for the stakeholders that we care about, for advancing broader public conversation. And so after a couple years of trying to figure out kind of what was the sort of messaging in our industry and what are some of the issues with that, reached out to my colleagues at Frameworks and to a couple of other organizations who were really essential to kind of getting this off the ground. So I want to thank the folks at HUD, some of the folks at the National Center for Healthy Housing, some of our folks internally at Make Room, and of course our Frameworks colleagues who are doing the research on this with us. So on the call today, what I thought we'd do is to do a couple things. I want to start by just talking about why we're doing this. There's so much communications research and focus groups and all kinds of things that, so some of you may be asking the question, I hope you are, don't we have enough research on this? Don't we know kind of like what the issues are? What I would say is no, and I think my colleague Nat would say the same thing. And so what we're trying to do is provide some more strategic and thoughtful intelligence about what we don't know that could really be helpful in terms of having a different, broader national conversation about housing and what we need. And then Nat's going to walk us through a little bit of the sort of research, kind of background, the thinking about framing and why this is a little bit different from some of the traditional efforts around communications. And then I'm going to take it back and talk a little bit about the practical applications of this work. So first, let's just talk about why, and I won't bore you with all the kind of nitty-gritty statistics of things, but I will say that for those of you like me who think a lot about data and analysis and statistics, one of the things is that over time, the issues of housing insecurity are getting bigger. When we think about housing insecurity, we think about the folks who are paying in the worst shape. For example, renters are something that Enterprise looks at very carefully. Renters who are paying 50% or more of their incomes for rent, and just how disastrous in terms of the consequences that can be for families who are in those circumstances. And even more families paying 30% or more, which is what we would call sort of moderate cost burden. And the only thing I want to show with this slide is really to say that this has been increasing over time, despite the efforts of Enterprise and lots of you in the field who've been working really, really hard to position affordable housing as an important platform in our communities. This is actually getting worse. And so what I want to say about that is we need a bigger tent here, people, right? I hope you already know that. But we need to figure out new partnerships, new ways of bringing people under the tent of understanding why housing is central, why we have to do something about it, why it's gotten out of control, and what we can do to do a better job with it. So I won't sort of bore you with all the statistics in that way, but I will say we know that we've got to make some changes in this regard. In the paper, we talk a little bit about this is not an issue that is only about low-income folks, although we tend to message that way. Housing insecurity is growing across all income bands, right? Whether you are moderately housing cost burdened or whether you're severely housing cost burdened, this has implications and I think opportunities potentially for our messaging. We're going to talk about that at the end for how we talk about these issues, but I wanted to say this is across whether you're low income or moderate income or whether you're high income, everybody's paying more for their housing, and that has lots of disastrous consequences for a whole range of different families. We know at Enterprise that it's not just the renters, but we've done some work to look at, to step back and say, and it's not just renters who are paying too much, but it's also homeowners. And you look at this slide, that middle bucket there, that 9 million, is about homeowners who are low-income homeowners who are paying 50% or more of their income for their mortgages. We got another 600,000 folks who are homeless, and if you look all the way on the right, even if you're not paying too much, which is the sort of what's happening in those first three buckets of work, there are another 24 million low-income persons in the United States today who are living in places where they are disconnected from opportunity. That means they're not living near decent transit, they're not living in places where they have access to good schools or jobs. And again, we think of this as a longer trajectory of things we are trying to address in our communities through the housing as a platform, but through our broader community development programs. And that message, the urgency of this, is not being well communicated, and hence, this is the why we're having this conversation today. So I hope you all know we are at this really catalytic moment, right? There's lots of things going on. Clearly, the issues of housing insecurity are top of mind for us, just the sheer numbers of people increasingly who find themselves in dire circumstances, in large part because housing, right, it's in large part because of their housing issues. We also know that it's interesting. There have been some really interesting advances at the state and local level for a lot of housing policies that are very useful and thoughtful, but some challenges at the national level. And lots of folks who are kind of in the middle of that juggernaut are trying to figure out how to advance policy at the state and local level and also at the national level. We know there's also been a lot of research. So folks who like Rod Shetty and other social scientists have been renewing this conversation about neighborhoods and opportunity and how housing fits into that, which actually is an incredible opening for us who are trying to message well in this kind of new, interesting political environment juggernaut that we find ourselves in. And then finally, there is this interesting, I think, at least among housers, I'm hearing a lot more in the willingness for folks to really think about and talk about racial equity, which I haven't heard this strongly in quite a long time. Some of that may be emerging because of the current political environment we find ourselves in. I think there's more to it than that. But I think, you know, when you put all that together, there is a real interesting moment for us, potentially, in being able, if we can craft this strong, sort of consolidated, coherent messaging to begin to sort of take advantage of these openings. And so that's a part of what the communications work that we're doing with the Frameworks Institute is really about. How do we take advantage of that and be thoughtful about that? So what I'm going to say is essentially what we've done with the Frameworks Institute so far is encapsulated in a report. Some of you may have access to it. If you don't, it's on Enterprise's website. You go to enterprisecommunity.org. You can download the report. And essentially what it tries to do is two things. It looks at what are the issues, what are the kind of messages that are backfiring and how they're backfiring. And it details, kind of inventories, what are the major areas of backfire. And then it provides some initial recommendations for what we can begin to do about that. And so you see just some of the two of the comments there on the left are some of the things that we saw when we began to look at even just news articles, and we just sort of plucked these out so you could get a sense of the flavor of how people are reacting to some of these basic kind of news stories that are trying to talk about the urgency around the affordable housing space. The first one is, I plucked it as the title of our report, which talks about, you know, you don't have to live here. If you can't afford to live here, essentially you don't have to be here, and essentially the same one on the bottom. If you can't afford to live in D.C., there's a simple solution. It's called moving. Essentially, no one is entitled to live here if they can't afford to do it on their own dime, and that's the flavor of the backfire that comes at us when we get it. So in the paper, what you'll find is we have outlined 6 major areas of backfire. These are the things that consistently, and I want to really emphasize that, these are the consistent ways that people, when they push back on this issue or the notion of affordable housing, this is where they go. And the reason that consistency is important for us is because if we know if this backfire is predictable, and we know that it is, then we have the opportunity to sort of get in front of it, and that's exactly what the research is about. So I want to just talk really generally through at a really high level through a few of these, and then I'm going to turn it over to Nat to talk about sort of the framing kind of response to some of this stuff. So the first area of backfire is really what I consider to be the most consistent and the most pernicious of all. It's this notion that poor people are poor because they make poor choices. They don't take personal responsibility. They don't sort of take the opportunity to access their own agency and make something bigger of their lives than they have. And most of all, in the housing space specifically, that translates into this conversation about mobility, the assumption of choices and the assumption of mobility. Over and over and over again, we heard in the conversation with folks, but also in the comments that you see reflected in some of these news articles, consistently the refrain is, if you can't afford where you live, then move. Why would you rent an apartment, and why would you pay, for example, more than 50% of your income if you couldn't afford to do so? That is a bad decision. That's like going to the mall and buying the Louis Vuitton purse, $1,500 purse, when all you really could afford was the blue jean purse. And so I'm being provocative here, but I want you to see, when you set housing up in the way that the public understands it as a consumer choice, right, they have made a choice to purchase housing that they could not afford, and now they want you to pay for that bad decision. When that gets activated, and it gets activated in the way that we talk about our work, in the way that we describe the work, even the way that I described at the very beginning, housing cost burden, that backfires extremely quickly. This is the one that comes back at us hardest. It's the one that's most pernicious, and for me, it's the one that really is the saddest. The second one is really the separate phase, right? So it's not only that they're making bad choices, but now they want you to pay for it, and you don't understand why you have a stake in that at all. I'm sorry, I didn't make the choice to purchase that housing that I could not afford, so why am I in a position to have to bail you out of that decision that you made? This comes back at us consistently, and it comes from this thinking that things are zero-sum. Not only that I got to bail you out, but if, for example, we have more government resources or more private investments going toward these kinds of activities, programs that help folks who are in difficult housing circumstances, then there won't be enough for the other folks who are middle class and struggling, or upper class and struggling. And so, again, that is really pernicious and very difficult to address. The third one, which is related, is this crisis that backfire, the fatalism, that this feels so big. There's so many people. There are millions of people in these circumstances, and it's a huge crisis. And now, with all the crisis that there is, our answer is that we want more public and private investment, more government attention to these issues, especially when, right, the notion is government hasn't been terribly effective in dealing with housing issues overall, right? Some of these government programs have perpetuated poverty, perpetuated racism in all kinds of ways, and so now your answer is more of the same. So you can see why that would initially have people push back very quickly. The next one is people really don't get cause and effect. So this is a quote about somebody talking about gentrifying D.C., and they say, gentrify every little bit of it because we got crime going on in D.C., and that's not being caused by folks who have money and who are, paying for the upper middle class households, being caused by those folks in, subsidized housing who don't have resources, or push them out, right? A part of this is that they really don't understand, hopefully, the sort of cause and effect. Crime is not simply being caused because you've got affordable housing. In fact, the opposite may be true. But because they really don't understand what's causing these kind of affordable housing issues, they don't understand, or they don't think about the ways that in the same way that we do, or what the potential solutions are. So if you understand the cause of what's happening, right, as people often do, as being people are poorly motivated, they don't take personal responsibility, they're making poor choices, the solution to that is not policy. The solution to that is punish poor people, right? And so you don't get, right, the policy support that you want when the default assumption is that the problem here, the cause of this is people's lack of motivation for wanting to live a better life. facts don't fit the frame. This is hard for me. I'm a data wonk. I live in the data world. I survive in the data world, but when facts don't fit the frame, we often in our work try to put so many of our facts and information out, but we often don't put that together in a way that makes sense to folks. And so when the facts that we have don't fit the way that people often think about this, they don't want to hear about the fact that we put more of our money into mortgage interest deductions than in rental housing. They don't want to hear about that. If the cause of the challenge is really about the fact that people are not motivated to do better, then what the hell does mortgage interest deduction have to do with that conversation? And so when the facts that we have and that we're presenting don't match the frame, the way that I understand what's happening, then I can dismiss those facts. It's a challenge, and we have to address it and deal with it. And then finally, the one that just challenges me more than anything, I think, as an African-American woman, is the continuing kind of issues around NIMBYism, and particularly the way that that gets really wedded to sort of race and sort of racial issues all the time. These issues around the fact that people have this assumption that people often make around segregation, that segregation is natural, that oftentimes, rich folks don't want to live around poor folks. If I'm in a community and you have a mixed income development that you are about to erect, that's great, but I do not want to live around folks who don't have resources. I don't want my kids going to school with kids who may not have like the best home upbringing or whatever it is. Those kind of assumptions often get in the way of some of these issues. And despite the fact that I think we've come a long way in terms of race issues and it's not just race, it's also economic segregation, but despite the fact that I think we've come a long way, we still have so far to come. And this is the one I think is really tough. So I'm going to stop there. I think we have done a really good job in the paper, I think, of trying to really outline this in very clear terms so that here's the consistency of what I'm facing. When I put my messaging out, here are the things that it's going to engender in part because of the way that people already think about these issues. It gives us some latitude to begin to make some different choices. And I'm going to turn this now over to Nat, because Nat specializes in how we think about what to do next.
Great. So as I turn over the controls to Nat, I just want to remind everyone that we will be taking questions. So at the end of the webinar, please make sure that if you have questions, you've typed them into the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will be sending out the slides and a link to the recording to everyone after this is complete. Nat, take it away.
All right, thank you very much. Everyone should just see a blank white screen. Don't worry, that's as it should be. But I want to start just by saying hello to everyone. Good afternoon to most, and I guess still morning, barely to some. I'm really excited to be here, and I want to start just quickly with 3 really important thank yous. The first one is to Amy and her colleagues at NHC for including me in this webinar. And for your really great and productive partnership. The second thank you is to Tiffany. As Tiffany said, she kind of stole my thunder, as she always does, that I've known Tiffany and have been working with Tiffany now for 10 years in a couple of different capacities, and just wanted to thank Tiffany and her colleagues at Enterprise for supporting this work, which I obviously think is really important, and I think Tiffany thinks is really important, but also just for being continuing to be a fantastic colleague and smart and insightful person to work with. And last but not least, I want to thank all of you who are on this call. I know your time is very valuable, and I hope that in return for your time that Tiffany and I can be helpful to you and give you some things to think about as you go back to your desks and you do the very hard but incredibly important work of telling news stories and communicating more effectively about issues of fair and affordable and healthy housing. And so my name is Nat Kendall Taylor. I am not I'm not a housing expert. I don't do research on housing. I'm not a wonk on housing like Tiffany is. I'm not a practitioner. I don't work on these issues. And before you log out of the webinar thinking that I have nothing to say, just bear with me for a moment. What I am is a psychological anthropologist, and what I study is the way that culture influences how people think about social issues and the decisions that they do or do not make as a result of their positions and attitudes and opinions on issues. And I get to do this work, and I say that intentionally. I think I'm really lucky to get to work on these issues with about 20 other framing dweebs across the social and cognitive sciences at the Frameworks Institute, where we study public understanding in a really deep, fundamental cultural level, not in terms of polls or a couple of focus groups, but really deep cultural work to understand those kind of backfires that Tiffany has just gone through. And then we study how you can actually get people to think and do different things by the way that you position, by the way that you frame your messages, your information, your communications about your issues. And my job today is to take you through and hopefully answer the two questions that you, again, hopefully see on your screen now. The first one is why I think all of you on this call should be thinking about framing given the work that you do and the goals that you have. And then if I've been even remotely and mildly successful in answering that first question, I'm going to move to the second one and show you kind of two quick, again, hopefully helpful recommendations that come out of the work that Tiffany and I and our shops have done and are moving and are continuing to do as we kind of continue to drill in and dig into these really tricky, I have to say tricky and frequently really counterintuitive issues when it comes to framing. So I'm going to start, surprise, surprise, in a very non-disruptive way with the first question. And the thing, again, you should be seeing a white screen. That's normal. Don't worry. The first thing to realize, and I think this as the first thing is both, it's one of these weird things that's both complete common sense and utterly game-changing in how we think about communications, is that as much as polling research and a lot of people who do public opinion research would have us believe that people have single views on social issues and are of single opinions when it comes to these things, this is simply absolutely not the case. And I'm here to tell you from where I stand as a psychological and social anthropologist is that this is neither how culture nor cognition works. And instead, a lot of work that we've done at Frameworks, but a lot of work that social and behavioral scientists have done for a very long time outside of Frameworks has found convincingly that we all have multiple ways, multiple mindsets, multiple constructs, multiple ways of thinking and making sense of social issues. I'm going to pull from our research on a couple of different issues to hopefully drive home this point. And we have done a lot of work on children's issues, issues of early childhood development, where you see this in really stark ways. In one sentence, people will be talking about young children using a way of thinking that rationalizes, that thinks about young children as just little adults. You know, they work just like you and me, same stuff's going on, same solutions apply and should be effective. And then in the next sentence, in a way that looks completely irrational when you're reviewing transcripts, they'll switch to this other way of thinking about young children, that young children aren't really people yet. They don't have real emotions, they don't remember, what goes on really doesn't matter. And so they're in this kind of state in between and not really yet being fully formed adults. Another one on taxes, where we've done a lot of work, and actually where Tiffany and I have done a lot of this work together in her former life as a frame worker. People can talk about taxes as these unfortunate draws down and ways that we have to use our money to pay for things that we are not able to see and do not realize the benefits from. And then in the very next sentence, people can talk about taxes and see them as essential for providing the public goods and services that we all drive on and use to act and be in the world. And finally, in bringing this home and building off of what Tiffany has said, in terms of housing, there's another one of these really, you know, when you look at transcripts, almost schizophrenic-looking things that happen in the data is that in one breath, people can be talking about, and unfortunately the one that we see on the left-hand side of the screen is much more dominant and explains those backfire effects. You can have people think about housing as this, at this individual level and in terms of this consumer good that people purchase, and you either can afford it or you can't, and that's the way the market works. And interestingly, that's the way this issue should work, and we really shouldn't do anything about it because this is natural and this is a function of the capitalistic society and culture that we live in. But in the next breath, when cued and having a different kind of conversation, people can realize and think really deeply and robustly about how we are all shaped in fundamental ways by what surrounds us, and can talk about the importance of housing more as a public good and as a really essential feature of what it means to do and be well in our society. And I'll talk a little bit more about these two, what anthropologists call cultural models, as we get forward in this presentation. So the first thing is that these models exist in all of us. We all have multiple ways of thinking, and these are highly shared. This deep, important stuff is highly shared. We all hold these models, although they may be of different salience and of different kind of degrees of top-of-mindedness for different ones of us, but we all have access to these ways of thinking. So that's the first thing to remember. The second thing to remember is that strategically these ways of thinking are not created equal. You're not going to get the anthropologist to say that people are stupid and culture is wrong. I'm actually kind of professionally invested in the idea that culture is never wrong, but when it comes to strategy, certain of these ways of thinking can impede or block our ability to get people to think about issues in specific or more expansive ways. And just to give you a quick example of this, the following message delivered, it's not fair that groups, and I've kind of highlighted in what hopefully you see as orange text, the really important frames that are in here. It's not fair that there are groups of people in this country who simply cannot afford quality housing. It's important that we make policies and design programs that make quality housing affordable for these people. And what that does, what we found really clearly in the research that Tiffany and I have done thus far, is that creates or activates or gets people in this mode of thinking in terms of separate fates, that there's kind of those people over there for whom these are issues, and then there's me and my people over here for whom they are not, and my fate is not connected to, contingent upon, or dependent upon the fates of others who are dealing with these problems. And when this way of thinking becomes active, it gets people to say and to espouse opinions that look and sound like this, that people in my community have housing, they work hard at it, and it may be difficult, but everyone I know has 4 walls and a roof over their head. Why should another person's inability to pay their rent be my concern? And you can see, this is, to use one of my favorite quotes, in this example we can see that culture eats our strategy for breakfast. Culture gets in the way, it keeps people from being in a place where they can access and appreciate the kinds of messages that we're trying to offer, the kinds of ideas and solutions for which we're advocating. So let's take another one. This is so there's all of these multiple shared ways. Some are unproductive, but some, and this is where we go from kind of pessimistic to hopey-changey and a bit optimistic, is that people do have ways of thinking that when active can get them to engage more productively and go to the places we want them to go. So here's another example of something that a housing advocate might say, that a zip code shouldn't limit people's opportunity to reach their potential and be contributing members of their communities. We need to create a society where everyone, regardless of where they live, has access to healthy and affordable housing. And we know that there are frames in this message, which I've conveniently for your benefit highlighted, that activate a very different way as compared to the separate fates model, a very different way for people to think about housing and why it matters and what's important and who it involves and who's responsible. A model or a way of thinking that we call fairness across places. And when this model guides and shapes people's thinking, you get these dramatically different opinions and attitudes and things that people are willing to support and places they're willing to go. And you get things that sound like it shouldn't matter if someone lives in a lower income neighborhood, they should have the same opportunities as the next person. You shouldn't be limited, again, in your opportunities because you're not rich or because you live in a certain neighborhood or part of the country. And you can see that in comparison to that last slide shaped by the model of separate fates, this fairness across places or fairness between places way of thinking is dramatically more productive and facilitates our communications. Now, the final thing, and this is, again, just I think awesome in terms of what it tells us about communications and what it kind of opens our eyes to, is that these ways of thinking aren't random and arbitrary in how they're activated, but instead, the way that we communicate determines which of these multiple ways of thinking becomes active and shapes opinions and attitudes. And so this is why political scientists, people in Tiffany's discipline, say that understanding is frame dependent. Let me just say it again. The way that we communicate shapes which of these available models becomes active and what people have as opinions and attitudes as a result. And I'm going to just go through what is kind of one of the seminal framing studies that I think, again, I'm a framing geek, so you may not agree, shows this really elegantly. So this is work in which 2 different messages are tested. The only thing that varies between the messages is what I've coded in orange there. That's kind of the frame. So the first is, given the importance of free speech, that's the frame. Would you favor allowing a hate group to hold a political rally? In the second message, the only thing that changed is that they sub out importance of free speech and put in risk of violence. And then the experiment is it asks people to indicate the degree to which they support this political rally in question. And we know that first way of communicating, that first message activates an available way that people have of thinking about these kinds of things, in which the importance of free speech is highlighted, it's foregrounded, it is the thing that's shaping people's thinking. And when this model becomes active by that frame in the message on the left, people are highly in favor of this kind of political rally. 85% are in favor. Now, the second message, which activates a very different way of thinking, again, a very different cultural model, one about danger and risk and others and us and them, and kind of that separate fates way of thinking, has a dramatically different effect on people's opinions and attitudes, causing a reduction in support for this particular activity by over half. Half of the support simply drops and is a function of nothing other than the way this issue is framed, activating a model and shaping opinions and support. So at this point, hopefully, I've been, mildly, somewhat successful in getting your attention and helping you think, or helping you realize that there is something to this framing stuff and we need to be thinking about it. And then I'm going to transition in the remaining 5 minutes of my allotted time here to tell you about how the work that Tiffany and I are doing and our colleagues are doing, how it tells us certain things, certain strategies that we can use in coming up with more effective frames and stories and messages about issues related to fair and affordable housing. And the first thing goes back to the backfire effects. It goes back to what I just talked about, which is, and I think this is, again, common sense, but utterly game-changing in the fact that this is so infrequently done when it comes to strategic communications, is that the key, and again, this is I'm biased here because this is really the role of anthropology in communications, is that being truly strategic as a communicator requires, it necessitates, it is compulsory that you understand the cultural beliefs and values and understandings that people are bringing to your issue, and you use that understanding to be proactive and intentional and strategic in the way that you communicate. And what this requires, what it necessitates, is that you do 3 specific things in your communication. So first of all, it requires that you become an expert on the multiple models that are available to people to think about affordable housing. And this, I'm not going to go into the detail here, but in great detail, it exists in the paper that Tiffany and I wrote, and an additional paper that can be found on our website at an address that I'll share on my final slide. The second thing that you have to do is you have to realize that just because people can think in those ways and none of them are wrong or stupid, strategically they are of different value, right? That what surrounds us shapes us, or that fairness between places way of thinking is dramatically more productive than other ways of thinking that people have access to. And finally, what we need to do as communicators, intentionally and actively, is develop ways of talking that selectively activate and deactivate those ways of thinking. We want to pull forward the what surrounds us shapes us, the fairness between places way of thinking, while simultaneously pushing back that individual consumerist way of thinking that Tiffany talked about, that creates such an imposing and impeding backfire effect in our communications. And just to give you an idea of what this looks like, we know, as I've said, that people have this individual consumerist way that they are able to think about housing, and that this is the most dominant way that people think specifically about affordable housing. But we also know, as I've said, that there's this other way of thinking that's there, that's available to people, that people are able to kind of put on and try on and use to think about housing issues. So we have to realize as communicators that these are both available. We have to also realize that as affordable housing advocates, these are not created equal in their strategic value. One eats our strategy for breakfast, and the other allows us to communicate much more effectively and get people to a place where they can appreciate our messages, the perspectives that we're trying to communicate, and specifically the solutions for which we're advocating. So our job as communicators is to do a little foregrounding and backgrounding here, is to push that individual consumerist way of thinking into the background, not intentionally, but by avoiding it, and instead try to come up with as many ways across as many organizations over as much time as we can to pull this what surrounds us shapes us way of thinking forward and increase its resonance and salience and top-of-mindedness as people think about the issues. The second thing is to become an expert in culture, but then to have a set of empirically tested, vetted strategies that we can use to communicate. And there are a number of these that range all the way from the tone we use to the values we endorse and the explanatory metaphors that we use to explain how our issues work. What I'm going to talk to you about in my remaining 30 seconds here is explanatory change. So things that explain how problems work and show how they can be addressed in order to deepen people's understanding, really motivate them to engage by instilling a feeling of efficacy and drive policy support. So in work that we've done with Tiffany, we've tested a number of different explanations or explanatory chains. This is one that you see in front of you. This is a fairly simple explanation of the problem of housing affordability. I'll give you just about 1, 2, 3 seconds to read that. Again, fairly accessible, straightforward explanation of the problem of housing affordability. In addition to that explanation, we tested one on that kind of makes the connection between housing affordability and community health, and we tested these messages quantitatively in a large sample, experiment that included over 4,000 people, and we wanted to see how these different messages moved people's opinions and attitudes and support for policies in a number of different domains, which you see along the horizontal axis here. And what you're going to see when I click this next button is the degree to which each of these explanations improved people's support and shifted their attitudes in these domains in positive directions. And when you do that, you see that these explanations are incredibly powerful in making people, in shifting their attitudes in positive directions and increasing their support kind of across the board for policy areas and issue domains that affordable housing folks really care about. And so with that, I'll leave the website here, and we can go back to this at the end, or Tiffany may have it, in which you can access kind of all of the research that we've done on housing thus far. And I will just thank you for your time before I hand it back to Tiffany, and really encourage you to frame on in your work. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Tiffany. Take it away, Tiff.
All right, so as I hand the controls back to Tiffany, for those of you who have joined us recently, I want to let you know that we will be taking questions at the end, and we will be making the presentation, both slides and recording, available after the webinar concludes by email in about a day or two. So Tiffany, go right ahead. Tiffany, I'm not sure that we can hear you.
Hello there.
All right.
So what you see on your screen is we are in the middle of this kind of researchers framework. We already know quite a bit about some of the things that are effective in beginning to reshape some of the backfire effect that we're seeing. So those are outlined in the report. I'll give you the link for those of you who haven't already had a chance to see it. But there are 10 things that we thought initially would be great suggestions for beginning to get up and over some of the backfire. I won't go through them. They're in the paper specifically, but I thought I might just highlight 3 of them and how they help you to do that, how they help you to shift the conversation. Let's go. I think probably 3, 4, and 5 are some of the ones that are probably the most powerful. One is sort of telling the story of us, sort of thinking about this issue about separate fates and how that tends to backfire consistently over time. So many of us are telling stories about individual families because we really care about what's happening to the people on the ground. We want to share their stories, how hard they're struggling, how hard they, right? The challenge with that is we often tell those stories in isolation of the broader kind of issues. How are we all implicated in that story? What's happening in sort of broader community? How we all are both implicated in that story, but also responsible for shaping the way that plays out. And so telling that story of us is bringing a broader range of stakeholders into the conversation so that people really understand what's their stake in our success. One of the challenges for us is, like, it's great that you all in Enterprise are doing that. It's great that you all, I could name a number of organizations who are doing great programmatic work on the ground. It's great that you're doing that, and how am I implicated in that is the question that people ask when they look at our messaging. The fourth one is really thinking about how housing is really connected to other issues. It's so interesting when you look at how we message as housers, when you see housing, a news story appear in the paper, housing issues appear in the paper when it's about housing. And that's it. And it's really extraordinary when you think about the fact that housing really affects so much. Housing affects education, housing affects our ability to go to work, our housing affects our kids, it affects our health. But the way that we tend to message about it is only when it has to do with housing. And so part of the recommendation here is to really work with our colleagues. When you see things in the paper where you know there are housing implications, housing should be on the agenda as we begin to talk about some of these other issues. That allows people to see housing as being connected to other things, not housing in isolation. The fifth so the recommendation we make is really the notion that Nat was talking about, really making the connection between cause and effect. As I said in the earlier comments, when people understand the cause and effect and the cause of this, or, the crisis that we are seeing, right, in the way that we've been talking about it, which is a challenge, as people's inability to solve their own problems, then the solution is not policy, the solution is to punish people. So we need to change that, and a part of it is getting some of those explanatory chains into the conversation about what is causing this and how we do that. Now, I will say that one of the things that stymies a lot of that work for us is that it's hard there's so many things going on. You feel like you got to explain so much. There's so much, and so we have to do a better job at getting those explanations down as much as we can, and some of that includes things like metaphors and other things that we're going to be working with frameworks on to develop to begin to help people understand very quickly what we mean when we say essentially what's causing some of these issues. So more of that to come. I just wanted to say that in the paper there are at least 10 things that you can begin to do today. We're happy to share sort of more of that conversation, but I'll sort of end this conversation there. So the last thing I want to say is sort of what comes next for us. We've got two trains sort of moving here. The first train is really finishing up the research. That's the part that we're doing, especially with frameworks. They've done all the stuff in the blue, the sort of descriptive part of the work, what is shaping the frames that people are currently using and accessing as they think about housing issues, which of those frames are useful and productive, which of those are not, the things that we want to pull forward, as Nat was talking about, the things that you want to background. The next part of it is, and there's still a significant part of the work to do, is really prescriptive. So what do you do about it? In addition to the 10 things that you see, there are lots of additional things that we think we can develop together that will help the field begin to make some more activate some different ways of thinking about these issues. So that's on the research front. The other piece of it, which we're working a little more closely with the National Housing Conference on, I hope to work with even more of you in the field, is really how do we turn this into an action agenda? How do we sort of make sure that we are not just sort of talking to ourselves, but really using the wisdom and the strategic intelligence coming out of the research in a very practical way. And so my expertise in doing that, the expertise of folks like Amy and other folks in the field who think about communications all the time, who understand our audience in terms of our practitioners in the field, the kinds of community opposition they're facing, and the kinds of things they're trying to say, we can be very helpful in terms of turning this into a much more action-oriented agenda. So I just wanted to stop there. As I said before, you can get the report on our website at enterprisecommunity.org, and I'm certainly happy to field some questions about the overall project that we're leading with the Frameworks Institute. So let me turn this back over to Amy, and I think we'll begin to take some questions from folks on the call.
All right. Thank you, Tiffany. So, folks, this is the last call for questions. We've got a bunch of great ones from everyone already. As you are typing them in, I just want to thank again Capital One for sponsoring NHC's webinar series. With the help of Capital One, NHC holds webinars regularly on a variety of housing policy, research, and communications topics. And you can check out our webinar archives at nhc.org. Finally, this is my shameless plug. If this webinar was beneficial to you, you should really consider attending Solutions for Housing Communications. This is our April convening on building support for affordable housing and countering community opposition. We'll have workshops and plenary sessions and mobile workshops on marketing, campaigns, organizing and outreach, all designed to help you build support for your work and counter community opposition to affordable housing. Early bird registration discounts are available right now, and we are also able to provide group discounts. So let's get to the questions. So a couple of clarifying questions. First for Tiffany, in your first set of slides, you had some statistics. Can you share with us the source of those stats?
Sure. So most of those are derivations from the American Community Survey that we, my team, and Knowledge Impact and Strategy team at Enterprise has done. I would say that we are sort of active on the trail of these stats, thinking very carefully about the kinds of data and information that will be important as we begin to make a better case for affordable housing. A part of that case making is about framing. That's a part of the conversation today. But the other piece for us is about the data that we're using to begin to engage audiences. Enterprise is working very hard on an opportunity index that really measures opportunity, including housing, in a much more robust way. We'll be talking about that in a couple, and very shortly. But I will say that just in terms of this conversation, that for me it really is about case making, which is framing, in addition to a larger way that we understand data and the kind of evidence that we're bringing about the impact of what we do forward. So more to come there.
Great, thank you. And Nat, we have a question about an author or a source who you cited. The name was Rattler or Rashid. Would you be able to spell that for us or repeat that for us?
I am not sure what which citation I used. If none of those names ring a bell, I'm more than happy to provide any citations. I'll go back through my slides and see if I can figure out what this person is referring to, and we can send it around. Amy, I'm sorry, but neither of those names ring a bell. So I'll try to do some research and digging, find whatever resource is being referred to, and absolutely make it available.
Excellent. Tiffany, it may have been you who made that citation I'm seeing now in the question. So we'll take a look into that. And someone in the questions is suggesting that it might have been Raj Chetty, who's done some poverty research recently. So there we go. All right.
Yeah, we can provide that for sure. Tiffany has that, and I have it too. It's a number of studies over the last probably 2 or 3 years that are most important.
Great. So we have a few questions from people asking about a variety of different housing types or housing issues, homelessness, renters, fair housing, and asking, is there research like this into those issues, and I think into how to communicate about those issues? And I think the broader question that I'd like you both to answer is, do we need specific messaging research around each of these different categories of housing and housing issues?
Yeah, so I'll take that initially. So I think, our initial work together was really, it's interesting. We started out this research really thinking about healthy housing and the way that health and housing sort of come together and how people think about those as two different domains, and really began to talk about that. Some of that research I think is on the Framework's website, just looking at how people think about that and looked at some of the gaps in understanding between how the experts think about that and how the public thinks about that, and some really interesting kind of interplay there. And then the next phase of it was really looking at affordability specifically, just generally speaking around housing. How do people think about affordability? And so what you see before you is really beginning to dig into some of these affordability issues. But I will say that some of the things, even in the initial work that we've done, the sort of policy domains we're asking folks about is really about then, great, if you understand these issues of housing affordability, then are you more likely to then support policies that lift up solutions around homelessness, or solutions around renters versus owners, or solutions around fair housing, solutions around racial disparities or racial equity. So there are a number of different sort of policy domains that we're already testing that sort of get at that. So some of that is embedded in the current stream. But I will say that, and Nat can certainly speak to this as well, when you begin each one of these kind of areas of work kind of help people, they expand people's understanding in very different ways. When you think about homelessness versus fair housing, there are some associations that people make with those kinds of things that are distinct. And so as we talk about this and as we sort of move the research forward, we're happy to sort of think together with other folks about how you sort of tweak the research, or how about how you tweak the narrative to begin to attend to some of those issues. Some of that may mean a little bit of additional research. It depends on kind of what the issues are.
Yeah, I'll just jump on there and basically say, yeah, what she said. But maybe expand it a little bit. I think it's a great question, and it's one that we're up against, that we come up against frequently, which is kind of, you know, how generalizable is a given issue area, or do we need to kind of drill down specifically and have a set of messages on kind of silos or issues within that issue? And it's like any good question, the answer is neither yes nor no. It's kind of, sort of. And what I mean is that we have found that framing does work differently when it comes to different issues. We're doing work in the UK right now that looks at poverty in a project, and housing and homelessness, and we find that at some level to move those issues, it does require strategies that are mildly different. But at the same time, having done this research now for 10 years across an incredibly wide range of social issues, you find that you are frequently up against some of the same cultural impediments to communication. So a lot of those backfires that Tiffany talked about, you know, separate fates or individual kind of willpower and bootstraps or consumerism, let me tell you, you know, housing affordability advocates are not the only issue advocates that are up against those really dominant and deep ways of thinking. So whether you're working on kind of government and budget and taxes, or immigration, or criminal justice, those are really dominant underpinning understandings that shape how people think. And so from that perspective, if we have general solutions from other areas that are really good at, for example, making people see the role of context, forwarding that what surrounds us shapes us model, or getting people to see issues as public instead of individual consumer issues, I'd say that there's great value in kind of learning how other issues have been able to do that, and importing some of the framing strategies into housing affordability issues. And the other good news is that all of the research that Frameworks has done for the last almost 20 years now, again, whether that's housing or immigration or criminal justice or early childhood or poverty or whatever, all of those studies are publicly available and free on our website. And I guess I would just kind of encourage you all to read not only within housing, but also to kind of go to some contiguous issues that face similar conceptual problems that we've tackled with communications.
Great, thank you both. So we're getting a few questions coming in about terminology. Housing doesn't work, low-income housing maybe doesn't work. There's sort of a euphemism treadmill that we've gotten ourselves onto in terms of the different words that we've used for the work that we do, and that we now feel like we have to get away from because they're not working as well, and you pointed to some of this as well. So what should we be doing instead? What's the right way to frame the work that we do?
That's a great question. I think, so I would say the prescriptive research on this is not complete. It will be soon, and we'll share a whole range of specific strategies. But I would say on the issue of this terminology, you know, housing is a tough thing. I mean, first of all, when you say housing to folks, and it sounds very clinical to folks, you know, housing sounds like, it doesn't sound like anything has to do with anything I would be involved in. I think about my home, right? And so, but that has some issues too. I think the thing that the recommendation that we make in the paper is to the extent that you can, sort of avoid at least this affordable housing terminology, not because we don't like it. I would say we love it. We you know, this is what we do, but because it just conjures up in the public imagination, public housing, it has all kinds of sort of racial connotations, all kinds of things that are negative. When you say that, you have to know what it activates in the public mind. And so, you know, from our vantage point, saying at least talking about homes or something like that, at least gets you away from some of that. That's something people can connect to. But I would say that we have to do a little bit more work on the research side of this to make sure that even that is activating the things that we want to do, which is more support for the kinds of work that we think is important in the field.
Yeah, and I'll just put in one sentence on that, which is I think the research thus far shows some caution around relying on terms. I mean, you have to use terms, but I think one thing that the research thus far, and I agree with Tiffany, you know, the answers aren't all in, but one thing that the research thus far shows to be really powerful is the value of something we don't do very frequently as communicators, of explaining the problems, how the issues work, and how the solutions address them. So I guess my recommendation that comes out of what Tiffany just said is really try to consciously not be over-reliant on a particular term. And unfortunately, It means you've got to do the harder work of generating really clear, engaging, resonant explanations of how your issues work and why they matter.
Thank you. So in addition to getting a lot of questions about communicating about specific types of housing issues, we're getting a lot of questions about how to communicate with specific audiences. So do we need to be coming up with different frames for elected officials versus affluent people who are opposed to affordable housing development in their community versus messaging for another group? Are there different cultural models that can be activated with these different groups of people, or do we share those models? And I'm also seeing a little bit of skepticism about the idea that we even do share any of these models and values. So I will let you address all of that as you wish.
Nat, take it away.
Why don't you, I had an audio problem on that one where I lost a couple, unfortunately, I lost a couple of keywords there. Can you start on that, Tiffany, while I figure out what the missing words were?
Yeah, so I think the basis of the question, which I think is an important one, is really do we really all share some of these models? Are we really is there a shared way of thinking that you can say across who we are that is that is contiguous, whether you are in the whether you're in the South and have a versus the folks in the Northeast, and I think this requires sort of two strands. I think, and the second part of the question, or I should say the first part of the question, was really then if people are very, very different in terms of their beliefs and orientations, then does that then mean that you need to have a different messaging strategy to address different folks? So I'm happy to start on that and have Nat sort of chime in on that, certainly. So there are things when the fact that we all grow up in this particular culture as Americans suggests that we have lots of things that we believe are in common. We grow up in a society kind of watching very similar kinds of being exposed to the same kinds of cultural models, being exposed to the same kinds of ideas about how things function, how the world works, and how it's supposed to work, and we share some of those things. Having said that, yeah, I think to the extent that people in the Northeast may think differently. I mean, we all talk about, like, for example, the Midwest, people have this sort of work ethos, and I have humility, and right, there's all those kind of things. So it means that when you're talking to different kinds of audiences, you may have to do more to pull some of those models out of folks if they're not sort of used to hearing them as much. So the message may need to be tweaked. But I think what I would say is, and I think Nat would agree, that the basic sort of framing sort of platform is relatively the same, and Frameworks works really hard to find those models that we have in common. There are lots of ones that are different, but to find those ones that we really have in common, and then think about how we then pull that out of different folks. It doesn't mean that you got to have a radically different message if you're going to the Rotary Club versus if you're going to the Mothers Club, but it does mean you might change the sort of, you might tweak the message a little bit, right, to attend to those audiences, but the basic core sort of meta model and sort of the meta narrative remains the same. It's the way that you communicate that narrative to different audiences may need to be tweaked. It may have a different twang. It may have a different emphasis, but the basic core message narrative is the same.
Yeah, again, what she said. I think I agree with everything that Tiffany said, and I think the key is that, and this is kind of hard for our minds to do analytically, is to realize that just because we have different ways that we think about issues doesn't mean that there are not common ways that underlie those. And so what our research really tries to do is it tries to find those common models that run underneath kind of more surface level cultural differences. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to harness what I think is like the most powerful part of communications, which is at the field level, which is communicating, disseminating, pushing out a common story about how an issue works and what needs to happen. And I think that that's the key. That's kind of the only way that culture change, which is what we're talking about, is really going to happen when it comes to these issues. And I think the other way of doing it, which is kind of segmentation, splinters the amplification effect of coming out with a common story. And like Tiffany said, that doesn't mean that that common story looks exactly the same to, in communities of faith as it does for business leaders, but there is incredible strategic power and effect of having a common message platform if our goal is kind of social change and moving an issue and changing culturally the dominance of those ways of thinking.
Great. So we've gotten a few questions about data, and they're coming from a couple of different directions. One line of inquiry is, so how do we use data if data isn't necessarily as effective as we think it is, or the way we've been using it isn't quite as effective as we think it is? How do we use that data? And then another line of inquiry is, essentially, are we in sort of a post-data environment now? To some, it seems like it feels like there's a data backlash, and is it even worthwhile to try to use data considering the sort of climate that we're in right now? I don't, Tiffany or Nat, if you...
Ooh, me. I'll take that one. Is that okay, Tiffany?
Go for it.
So this is one that I have thought a lot about. I actually just wrote something that I'm trying to get in somewhere as an op-ed or something. But I think I can be reassuring here, and I think there's this tendency that we have to bifurcate or make things really simple in their oppositional nature. So we either think that data is everything and data is king or queen or whatever, data is all that matters, or we think that it matters not at all. And the real answer is somewhere in between. And I think that post-truth and facts don't matter. I can be reassuring and say that I fundamentally and absolutely disagree with those kinds of statements. I do not think we are living in a post-truth world. But I do think that there are specific ways that we have to learn how to use data so that they can have the same effects for those who are not us, for normal people, that they have for us who study issues. And I think that that's the real work that needs to be done. We've done a lot of work in immigration and criminal justice that's found that data on their own are, surprise, surprise, really ineffective, if not counterproductive. But that when you build an effective frame around data, when you give people a value through which kind of to come to and look at the data, where you give people a metaphor that explains how an issue works and then map on the data, that data actually turns up the power of a message as compared to a message that doesn't have data. So I firmly believe that data still matter, but I think it's realizing that data cannot be our frame, but rather that they need to be framed. And that is something that I imagine that Tiffany and I will be working on, especially given who Tiffany is and what she thinks about data, that we'll be working on as we go forward in this process of testing messages. What is the best way of using the tremendous data that this field is generating? And I firmly believe that there is a way of using that data that will make messages more effective. It's just figuring out the strategy, the kind of way to build it in, and the slot that data fits into in a larger message, in a larger story, in a larger frame.
Yeah, and yes, I think that's great, and I want to tack onto that. And I would say, when I think about data, I think data matters, but for what? Certainly, it can be helpful in the way that Nat is talking about. I want to also just add to that conversation that I think I want us also as housers to rethink the data that we're using to make the case for why affordable housing is important. And I will say, Enterprise is as guilty of this as anybody else, but the data we're using or have been using is not terribly effective. So just take the example of what I shared at the very beginning of this presentation, which is the large numbers of folks who are housing cost burdened. So we're saying this many people are paying 50% or more of their income for housing. I got to tell you that if you're trying to bring new people under the tent of understanding affordable housing and even why it matters, that data is not convincing anybody. That data is not moving anybody. It's just not. They're just saying that people are paying, like, I'm probably paying too much for shoes. Yeah, I mean, and when you see, I would encourage you all, if you just go to the Washington Post or some of these other newspaper articles and just type in the affordable housing and look at some of the recent stories they've been writing about the crisis in affordable housing and the data. And what you'll see is a set of this kind of backfires, or people are talking about that. In fact, I think there was 1 or 2 in the slides that I had. People were saying, "Are you kidding? This is ridiculous. Like, who but the very rich is not like paying too much for the things that they don't want to pay for and not enough for the things they want to pay for. So I think there's a space for us to really begin to rethink the kind of data we're using to make the case and to say, wait a minute, maybe this data we're using is not making the case. And that's what I was saying before. The better case to be made is what happens in a community when you don't have affordable housing. And so the impact assessment, right, of what happens when you do, but also when you don't do anything about affordable, that's the data we need. A part of what we're doing on the Opportunity Index is talking about what is the wider range of data connected across these different sectors that actually makes for a better story than the one we're telling. So it is, I think, you know, it's absolutely right. We have to do a better job of using data, right, as a part of our storytelling. That was the point that Nat was making. We actually, once we do that, I think we get data to be useful to full effect. But the other thing is we got to step back and say, wait a minute, who's convinced by this data point? Like who am I bringing under the tent here that wasn't already under this tent because they saw this data point? And once you look at that data and with those new eyes, I think it'll force you to kind of rethink kind of the data that you're collecting or the data that you have, and for our field, I think to rethink how we're the kind of data we're capturing and using to make our case.
Great. So Tiffany, you mentioned that there's a housing crisis and that's that's messaging that many of us often use, and as has been pointed out, not necessarily to great effect because of the backfiring issue. We have a question about the challenge that a lot of folks have in convincing elected officials that housing should be a priority to them. How do you make the case that something is urgent without triggering the fatalism mind trap?
Yeah, so that's a huge one. I think that's exactly the kind of sort of data conversation that we were just having. We use these large numbers because we think when you say this many people are suffering from this issue, and I have to say I don't think there's anything wrong with saying here's the magnitude of what we're facing. There are a whole lot of people in our community that are not able to make the rent or that are not able to pay their mortgages, not simply because they don't have the willpower to do so, but because their wages haven't risen in such a long time compared to housing prices that they're being forced out literally of places, neighborhoods they've lived in for a very long time. So I think this issue of kind of how we use data to sort of understand the magnitude of the problem, no problem there. The challenge is how you get people to engage around these issues. When you start having that crisis message, you get, and I would say let's just back up and say why we even start with that kind of messaging. We start talking crisis because we want people to see the urgency of it. We want people to engage and think that this is really important. But what actually happens is the opposite. They disengage, not because they don't care that these numbers, great numbers of folks are in these dire circumstances. They disengage because there's so many crises already going on. I mean, you got people at the airports and trying to deal with immigration and a Muslim ban. You got Syria going on, and you got the school systems. You got Social Security. I mean, every nightly news program is 10 different crises, and then at the back of that list you want to add housing to that. Good luck with that, because nobody's buying that. So I think that the messaging, so the way that we understand from a messaging standpoint to get people their sense of engagement traditionally has been to think about American sort of pragmatism. We love that kind of stuff. We love to say, Americans have a can-do spirit. Or if you're in Denver, you say, in Denver, we have a can-do spirit. We have solved all kind of problems. We are a region that is strong. We've done all kinds of things. And now we are faced with a challenge that we are more than equipped to handle. We need to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We are forward-thinking people who are solving social problems. We're solving this particular challenge for our region, and we know we're using solutions that work. Here's examples of of what's working and why we think it's important that we get on board with this. That's the kind of language that gets people excited. When you start going down that road of pragmatism, people's socks go up and down. They get all excited because you are literally sewing into their identity, right, as people who can get things done. And when you do that, you get people excited. You get their urgency up without making this thing seem so large that we're never going to be able to solve it. And that's really kind of the space you want to be in.
Right. So one of the interesting questions that we got early on was about the research that has come to the fore recently about the impact of the toxic stress of poverty on people's decision making. And so I guess I wonder if either of you sort of see parallels between some of what we see with those cognitive challenges and some of the research that you've done.
I'm not sure what you're asking, Amy. Say it a little differently so I get it.
Sure. So the participant asked about research that says that it's harder to make good decisions when you're burdened by poverty and you're sort of experiencing difficult situations and struggling and that kind of thing. I think this person is interested in sort of the cognitive aspect of that toxic stress can change people's thinking, and is it possible maybe that some of this plays into the issues that we have in communicating?
I can try to take that, Tiffany, while you think and then have my back. So I cannot comment on the actual science of that. Do housing issues impinge upon what is called the kind of bandwidth argument in the poverty research? I would suspect that they do in a similar way, but I can't comment on that from a science perspective. I can comment on that from a framing perspective, and I guess what I would say is that I would be really careful from a framing perspective on those messages, particularly anyone where you're trying to use kind of a neuroscientific basis to make that argument. And what we found is that, and I think this isn't surprising, is that low-income communities or communities of color, guess what? They don't respond very well when they hear a message that's saying that their experiences have caused what is frequently perceived as irreparable damage to their brains. And I think that is a potential takeaway of that research. It certainly is a potential takeaway of the poverty, of that argument in the poverty research, and it certainly is a potential takeaway when you talk about poverty and toxic stress. And so I would say that there's a lot of framing bells and whistles that go off to me when I hear about those kinds of arguments. And I guess I have to restrict my commentary to the framing aspect of this, and that if research to that effect does exist, and it is solid and robust and well kind of validated across multiple studies, and you want to use that to talk about the burdens of affordable housing issues, I would just be incredibly cautious with how that's communicated, because I see the potential for backfires beyond the magnitude of the ones that Tiffany talked about that are potentially there in communicating that kind of an argument, that kind of research.
Yeah, I would say ditto on that. I would be very cautious about that. I think is there that kind of link in some respects? I think it's not just toxic stress. I think when people are under all kinds of stress, does it change the way that they think? Absolutely. There's a great book, I don't know if people have read it, called Scarcity. Why having too little means so much, and they talk in the book. The authors, I think it came out 2 years ago. I have to pull it out, but it talks a lot about how people function when they are thinking from the vantage point of not having enough. I think this is the same kind of thing when people are kind of under stress, when they feel like they don't have enough. That actually changes cognitively how they make decisions. I think we know a lot more about those kinds of things. Should we be making that kind of argument in terms of our housing issues? I think I would side with Nat on that. I think it's just the backfire potential of that is just huge. But where I think it could be useful for us on the other swap side of things is in thinking about framing. When people are thinking from their own vantage point about their own scarcity. So when I'm thinking about my pocketbook as a middle-class American and how I'm struggling hard and how my housing costs have risen and how I'm struggling to get my middle-class boys off to school and trying to make sure they have a promising future, and I'm afraid for their future, it makes it very difficult for me to be thoughtful about helping somebody else's children, about making sure somebody else makes the rent. And so when you look at how the sort of community opposition, the folks who sort of bring those models forward, what they try and do is put you in the mindset or focus on your identity on that part of your life. What they talk about, all the stuff you lose essentially if you support affordable housing. Your property values are going to go down, and the safety in your community are going to, right, all because it puts you in a mindset that makes you make decisions very differently. So from a framing standpoint, understanding that can be very useful in terms of how we message and how we lift up people's identity in a different way as part of the conversation. In terms of building that into messaging, oh boy, you talk about backfires. You ain't seen nothing yet.
All right, thank you. So I think we have time for one more question. There are a ton of questions that we didn't get to. I will do my best to follow up with as many of you as possible afterwards. And some of the questions that you have, I think, will be covered in some of the future webinars and discussions that we have at NHC and at the Solutions for Housing Communications convening. So I hope that we can keep this conversation going. But the last question I want to share with both of you is about community opposition to affordable housing development, the NIMBY issue, and how a lot of the opposition that we experience has a real sort of broken record quality to it. People concerned about things that the developer has already dealt with and made clear that they've dealt with. And I think a lot of the complaints that people have and the concerns that people have, some of them are legitimate and can be addressed and should be addressed in some way, but a lot of them are sort of code for other things, or are just the kind of layers of complaints that people have before you get down to whatever the core issue is. So how can we deal effectively with that kind of broken record style of opposition?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'll say, so actually as part of the webinar today, I had in the deck, I was going to do a little bit of the actively online, the deconstruction of a message that was kind of community opposition, and then looking at how we can use the recommendations we've made so far to then reconstruct a message that effectively kind of address some of those issues. But I think, when I look at the kind of, community opposition, you're right, they recount the same kind of stuff over and over again, but it's usually encased in a message that's much larger. And our response to that is to change the frame. As Nat was saying on the call, you can actually background a whole lot of that stuff by pivoting to a frame that's very different. I have to say, one of the things that our current president is very good at, I'm trying to be positive here, is being able to pivot, to take a frame that has been given, right, to him about whatever it is, and to move on seamlessly to something else. Now, there may not be many things that we are enamored with about this current person, but I will say that we have to get better about pivoting off of somebody else's frame to our own frame. What tends to happen is the community comes back with a whole series of things, and then we think we have to rebut all of that stuff. In fact, the example that I was going to give today was where somebody was basically rebutting word for word all the things that the opposing group has said, and it was like, oh my God, you're just reminding everybody of all the things, right, that they already sort of believe at the core, and they're not going to listen till you get to the stuff of like why this is not true. So I'd say that skill set is something that we have to get better at, pivoting to a different frame, a frame that is about where you live sort of shapes you very differently, about fairness across places, a frame that actually lifts up the things that we care about, and that moves public support for the policies that we are thoughtful about. And so I think in the next kind of iteration of the research, you see us switch a little bit more from the sort of what are the backfires to how do you pivot to a frame that actually does more to kind of shift the winds, if you will, in terms of affordable housing.
So to follow up to that, and maybe Nat, this is something you can tackle as well, what's the difference between pivoting and avoiding the question? Because I think people do want to address concerns and have some degree of obligation to address those concerns.
Yeah, I mean, not answering the question is I take that to mean it's kind of not even engaging the general topic of conversation. Pivoting is engaging in the issue, very quickly acknowledging the thing that you are responding to, but actively not giving it kind of room to breathe, and then moving the conversation to where you want it to go. And so I think that the difference between not answering the question and pivoting is more than semantic. I think that those are different strategies. And I think that not answering the question is something that is very likely to get a message rejected, whereas pivoting, kind of engaging the idea quickly and then moving the conversation in a different direction, is less likely, if done with great skill, to be met with rejection. And I mean, this is all of the stuff that we're hearing these days about these narratives that are moving our issues in directions that we may not like. I think the biggest danger in this is that people take on those narratives, respond to them at length, explain why they're not the case, and inadvertently blow them up, give them room to breathe and increase their resonance and the degree to which they're repeated, and make them kind of more normal and accepted. And I think that the strategy that Tiffany's talking about of pivoting could not be more important right now than ever before. And I would, we're not going to be able to dig into it more than that, but I think that is so important, trying to get to the story that you want to tell, rather than feeling like you've got to take on the story that's being told.
All right.
Yeah, and I would just follow up on that, and I would just say too that we don't often get a lot of time in airtime to talk about our issues. Affordable housing rarely kind of gets on the political agenda. When there's some news story and we're being, the microphone is in your face. Don't use your real estate, right? No pun intended. But don't use your real estate to refute somebody else's claim. You got to pivot and move on to the stuff that is more central to the things that we know really reflect the kind of policies and the kind of posture that we know kind of supports our, our policies. And so again, more than anything, don't give away the little bit of real estate that we have, right, trying to refute somebody else's stuff that's not really relevant. And it's hard because some of it is so pernicious and it's so, it's tough. But that kind of discipline is a part of what I think we need to have. Otherwise, we will not sort of win in the current environment.
Right. We can't play defense all the time. We have to get the ball and do something with it.
You got it.
Use a sports metaphor and apologize to those who don't appreciate those. Well, thank you both so much for your time and your expertise, and to everyone who joined the webinar, particularly those of you who stayed on for all of the Q&A. We'll send all kinds of links to you hopefully tomorrow, so you can rewatch, see the resources, see all the great links that Tiffany and Nat shared. Thanks so much for joining us, and we hope to have you here on another NHC webinar soon.
Thanks so much, Amy. Bye-bye.